So our last session is being presented by Caitlin Fisher. Caitlin Fisher holds a Canada Research Chair in Digital Culture in the Department of Film at York University. She's a co-founder of York's Future Cinema Lab, in which her research investigates narrative through explorations of interactive storytelling and interactive cinema in augmented reality environments. Earlier this year, Fisher's lab launched Future Stories Press, dedicated to promoting new book forms, included augmented reality pop-up books, ebooks, and immersive apps. Very happy to have her here today to discuss narrative futures in augmented reality. Please welcome Caitlin Fisher.
I'm glad everybody has like sugar reinforcements. It's that time of the day. So thank you very much for welcoming me here. I was trying to think back to figure out how I ended up getting this invitation, because I'm thrilled to be here and everything's been so interesting that I've heard. And I think, I'm assuming that I was invited in part because of the lab I direct, but it's sort of an interesting return because I used to speak at a number of sort of Future the Book conferences. About 20 years ago, I started really my work as a hypermedia novelist. So my creative practice was in hypermedia storytelling, first in HyperCard and later in StorySpace, then in HTML. So I began, first I have a huge confession to make. The first thing was, note the slide didn't begin with the book, it began with a little narrative world. This is my design sense, as well as my practice, so I feel like suitably humiliated. So I'm bracketing all of this off, that I work really in a different environment than you do, with different constraints. I rarely have to get things to market. I rarely have to have things perfectly designed. And while I'm very, very interested in the user experience, it doesn't affect my bottom line or my capacity to do my work. So we have a lot of things that look awful. And so here's my thing. So my 2001 hypermedia novella, and I've got like the badly designed, it's very Rococo. I liked it. The reason why I hadn't thought of going back this far and giving you this slide, but I think it actually does explain why we're involved in very cognate processes. And I think that, to jump right to almost one of my last slides, I think those of you who are working now professionally in the creation of ebooks and in the industry, I think it's very, very resonant, and we should have better conversations with those of us who work in research labs with different time horizons, with different kinds of technologies, and not assume that these are always parallel paths. I think really, I was trying to figure out a date the last time I was asked to speak at a sort of a Future Book event, and I think it was 2003. Yeah. So I'll just let this run a little bit. So this is like 2001. The whole thing would have been in Flash. You can see it kind of poorly designed. What I liked and what really attracted me initially to electronic literature, this was supposed to be like a young girl's diary, and it's very sort of multi-layered. And it's horrible now. But I mean, you think, okay, well, it was 1998, right? And it won a big award. Well, and that's an interesting thing, too. At the time, the reason I rushed to finish this was there was a lot of .com money. And this actually did win the International Electronic Literature Award for Fiction in 2001. And it was a $10,000 award that was going to be endowed to to encourage innovation in digital literature. And then they all went bust. So it never became the sustained award. But one of the things that I'm just going to stop this here. One of the things that I really learned from that, and what I liked about electronic literature, was that it enabled me to think of things that digital technology would let me do that a print book would not do. What was the difference between a hypertext novel or a hypermedia novel and a print novel? And so for something like this, my first, this really early work for me, what I liked was that a simple developmental novel was complicated in really interesting ways through an associative linking structure. So you messed with causality, you messed with the developmental novel, you messed with all sorts of things. And of course, you could bring in sound, you could bring in images. But I think fundamentally for me, a complicated linking structure meant that you ended up with a different kind of experimental narrative and rereading. So that informs my thinking about what I loved, which is very, very different from the way the industry actually went. But bear with me, there are a few things where it comes closer together. So from sort of my fiction practice, and I did doctoral work in this area, and I did an entirely digital dissertation. So I was very interested in doing born digital work and also imagining these for nonfiction, for argumentative and theoretical work, as well as for fiction and poetry. I ended up collaborating closely with Georgia Tech down in the US, where they were working very hard to develop interfaces for writers and artists and designers to work in sort of the emerging area of augmented reality. It's been around as an industrial application for a long time. And my lab's been going for about a decade with the original support from Georgia Tech. And I was really drawn to this, partly because, as we've come up a couple of times here, I actually like physical objects. I do like the real world. I like holding books. I like holding things. I also love the digital. The idea that these would come together in meaningful ways and that there was a technology where the tactile and the digital were co-constitutive in the story was fundamentally fascinating. And of course, like anything, like any new job, we've all been there, right? Like you get this lab and I'm like, oh my gosh, I only know the screen. And now I've got the space to walk through. It's, you know, so it ended up being a practice that some of the translatable skills were, of course, writing and the coding that I brought to it, but also closer maybe to installation. My appointment ended up being in film. And increasingly, you know, the work at that time and the trajectory of this kind of electronic literature community, as opposed to the, and I guess I say electronic literature, it's a very vibrant community that monetizes nothing. And you should all be better friends. It's an incredible gift economy. It's, you know, definitely, you know, good 25 years of experimental writing and fiction, and people largely self-publish and do it for free or work in university labs. So, okay, hang on, let me just go through here. So I ended up with this lab that was kind of scary and amazing and haunting, and trying to figure out what to do with it. The industry itself, this is something where it can be, oh, well, you know, Caitlin likes these kind of niche experimental areas, but, you know, what does it have to do with publishing? This could be a massive industry. You know, I was at the Augmented World Expo in Santa Clara in the spring, predicting $200 billion. And at the moment, the go-to industry for that will be advertising. But it could equally be, not equally, but I mean, I think it's in a tremendously interesting area for fiction, for nonfiction, for education. It's already, you know, a lot of use in industry. And the HCI is changing too. So I've got a picture here of my, one of my doctoral students, Helen Papagiannis, who also is Chief Innovation Officer at Infinity AR in New York. And you know, we've spent a decade trying to imagine, you know, we talk about, do you work within existing constraints and, you know, do you imagine sort of beyond how horrible they are right now? Well, of course, you know, my lab situation is we have to do both. Most of the technology has not nearly caught up to our imaginations. And we work with students who have incredible creative capacity and imaginations and translatable skills from all sorts of disciplines and areas. And we are always trying to push the technology and wait for things to catch up. So we are one of those labs where we've sent people out on, like, you know, 3 hours with an iPad out like that. And we don't kid ourselves. Nobody's going to, like, make money by sending people out with an iPad. Nobody even, you know, nobody even really wants to do a mobile gaming experience as they run 3 blocks to get to the next hotspot. We're at this very weird cusp moment where the technology is just starting to catch up again. And things like Google Glass or more locally Meta might make a big difference, an HCI difference in terms of the kinds of stories we can tell and how long the questions can be. One thing I just wanted to mention with this slide, early this morning somebody was saying, well, you know, are there if I'm not misunderstanding the question, are there areas where the digital could enhance the analog or the gallery space or move seamlessly? And I would say that augmented reality is one of those technologies that, at this moment, you can have an app that can enhance a print book, that can also work in a gallery situation, that can also provide a mobile experience. So we do that a lot. We work with museums. We do have sort of haunted objects. We work with artists to make sort of living paintings. We develop new expressive tools. We work a lot on software development for people who don't program. Most of our students come in through, well, certainly Center for Computer Vision, but also through the Faculty of Fine Arts from Communication and Culture. They come in as writers, they come in as filmmakers with a very keen visual sense, and often they don't know how to code, so we do a lot of drag and drop. We work very hard at the interface. Reason being that we think that we need a critical mass of books and stories to find out what's going to be good. One of my collaborator, Jay Bolter at Georgia Tech, actually kind of, famously says, it's like film at the turn of the last century, where the conventions haven't been written yet, and it's an exciting time for that reason. New stories for new screens. We actually have lots of different screens. It's not just augmented reality. It's not just looking towards glass. We have fog screens. We have, anything we can get, we purchase. We will go on Kickstarter. We purchase, that first generation of Oculus Rift that makes everybody seasick. So anything we get, we try. You can see in the slide too, we have a very large tracking area. Probably at the time of installation, it was certainly the largest tracking area in a fine arts context or a creative context anywhere in the world. So we track about 1,000 square feet, and you can actually move through an augmented reality environment and tell interactive stories. Students make spatial cinema, hyperfictions, things that are less of interest to this group, like database documentaries, but interfaces, experience design. We've got a lot of interests that are in common. I have, interests in visualizations that I think will become certainly some kind of future books. I think data visualization and life logging mining will become interesting instances of possibly memoir, biography, large fiction. We do locative media. And I think one of the reasons why we can fool around with all of these different kinds of things and buy different items and be platform agnostic is that we have the luxury of not having to bring products to market, which is the luxury of failure, which I know that many of you do not have. So in some ways, I always like to tell my students to take that luxury incredibly seriously and to fail often, because it's a very sort of privileged space to be able to try things, and if they don't work, nobody loses their job. So we have a lot of failures. We work iteratively across boundaries, particularly between film and computer science. I've never really had the experience of selling anything, but it's very difficult to actually have a product that you have to sell in the context of the Canadian University. And one of my key collaborators for some of our early marker tracking libraries, for a lot of reasons, a lot of IP issues, we had to sell it. And so as a consequence, the only way, what we needed to do was to start a company. So we did begin a company basically to sell augmented reality software, largely to writers, the educational market. And then we've sort of spun that out into an augmented reality press with new apps and things that are, just sort of on the verge of coming to market now. We give a lot of workshops, and of course we're funded with quite a bit of public money. So we like to give a lot of free things back. So most of what we build actually is free. There's our tracking grid. So for the rest of the talk here, I want to talk a little bit about what we've done and what we've learned. I know it's the last session, so I'm trying to have a little bit of show and tell, and hopefully to give you enough information about the kinds of things we do that maybe you can find ways that it resonates with some of your own practices or goals. So some of our early tools were tools that we developed ourselves. At the beginning, every single thing had to be custom. Every single feature that we wanted, we had to build. We had to make a team. The software didn't exist. One of the things that's happened really even in the last 3 years has been the commercial software has basically just our entire wish list has largely been satisfied through combinations of, powerful game engines like Unity and augmented reality plugins like Vuforia. For easy student work, there are like off-the-shelf apps like Erasmus that can make, little augmented reality. We still use our own custom software for rapid prototyping. But it was, it's sort of that interesting moment. I think you learn so much through the building of software and interfaces, and you learn a lot about how the technology works with story. And at the same time, it's important to recognize when you no longer have a comparative advantage. So we work a lot now on working on code that can bring together different kinds of experiences. So that's what the early Snapdragon looked like. Here is, I'll show this a little bit just because, it's terrible design work, but this actually won the International Digital Literature Award for Poetry in 2008. Again, this is a community where it's largely around story, particular kind of innovation. In your industry, you could never get away with buying a pop-up book from a dollar store and sticking markers on it and handing it in. But part of it was it's a proof of concept, right? So we work a lot at the prototype stage, and then I don't put $1,000 into actually building it. I didn't really imagine that there was an audience that keen on it at the time who were going to be using augmented reality. In 2008, who's going to buy my augmented reality poetry? So sometimes it's good that these things can stay at the prototype stage, and then they just become learning tools for works that follow. One funny story about this, though, is you can tell, I don't know if this is still going. Hang on. Do you hear how it's all overlapping? So one of the things that happened was we couldn't fix the code in time, and I'm not really that kind of a poet, but we couldn't get the markers to actually go sequentially, so they were this whole cacophony, and I think that's why I won, because I thought it was a sound poem. Because my reputation is very much, they're the fiction people and the poetry people. So I was like, how did I get in there with the poetry people? I was like, code error. So I'll admit that now because it's many years later. This I'll just show you briefly. One of the things that happened that was very interesting is when I moved from things that were purely on the screen. So for example, that 2001 work where, how can I view your work? Well, here's the URL. You can see it, totally digital. Starting to work in augmented reality, it was, so how can I see your work? And I was realizing, oh, wow, I have to send you objects, and I have to send you this marker system, and I have to send you the code, and I have to send you viewing instructions. And all of a sudden, something that had been so clean and lean and easy was enormously complicated. So you don't need to really listen to this, but part of it was, we started putting stickers on everything. I mean, my students had like stickers on their arms. They had their stickers on
webcam, computer, granularity 12, difficulty level 6, with opportunities for customization, including scale, story levitation, and story positioning in the real.
It was kind of tongue-in-cheek. We made lots of treasure boxes.
Stickers. The father will print out an infinite number of marker sets, clone this work, suggested physical objects, one background, one pair of underwear, a water glass, etc. Kits may not be exactly as shown. A standalone Max app, an original all true stories expressed as MOV files included.
And one of the things that was interesting about that, I'll just pause that, is that, of course, that once you let the code out into the world, and then, this isn't your world, but this is mine, once you give markers and code and instructions, people can mash it up however they like. The scale can be different. They could be poster size. They can be put on clothing. It doesn't have to be a treasure box anymore. It can be someone's washroom. So it was very interesting to watch how a lot of these works translated and how they move from community to community. There are also a lot of educational uses for augmented reality. We recreate a lot of early cinema. We've got a funded project looking at Expo 67 and recreating the pavilions there. I'm going to skip this slide and just go to the next one, because one of the things you can do, of course, is have a single marker and the 3D object comes up. And in this case, we can have a 3D model. We can have the cinema that was playing in the pavilion. There's a very easy way to enhance an educational book. So you could actually have something that was a digital add-on to an analog book. And that's some of the stuff we're doing. And we also play with scale a lot to try to figure out what kind of digital work works best at what scale, or how we should be using it. So in the case of this particular model, we actually have a large size model you can walk through in our large track system, as well as these small handhelds. And we're very interested in finding out if that helps us to tell different kinds of stories, or whether, you know, the scale of the story will make a big difference. Here's another piece, an early piece that was still using a marker tracking system. So this is AR tabletop theater, where once again, we work a lot just with found objects. It's not because we dislike nicely designed things. But again, when you're working quickly and trying to figure out what works, these become the early stages to figure out where we end up putting our resources and our money later. So this is sort of like a classic, I suppose could have been, I don't know if it really would have been a short story, but sort of interconnected, spatialized audio, and I imagined it as more theater than book. So here's one way augmented reality works with very simple, affordable computer vision.
At 6, I say to Jelly, that's what I call my grandmother, when I get older, I will have a baby and I will give it to you. She laughs. I've been with my grandmother forever, since my parents went on holiday to Morocco in 1967 and didn't come back. No one bought me sleepers, just waited for my little feet to pop through the bottoms of the thin material in 1968. Finally. It just wouldn't be waiting in good faith to buy sleepers. They won't come back. They might come back. They don't come back. I've been with my grandmother since last summer. I back in at night. At 7, she takes me for a portrait, parents only. I'm sitting in a big chair in front of the camera. I can barely hear her hiss to the woman at the front desk. Can't orphans have their pictures taken? Oh, your mother and father would kill me if they heard that, she tells me later. I hold her hand. We laugh because clearly I am not an orphan. I hear stories about my mother who was walking along the street one day and saw that a ship was leaving the next week and knew she should be on it, so she was. It's the 60s after all. She's a papermaker, a linguist, a painter, a flamenco dancer, and a very smart girl, alone on a boat and on her way to Europe. I remember going somewhere and waving at that ship. Is that my mother going? Tap, tap, tap. Morse code on my grandmother's shoulder. Take me home. I hear stories about my friends and I try very hard to let our mothers know how much we love them. Our mothers are small, after all, and easily hurt. We have mothers who cry, sleep all day, weave curtains from beads we later choke on. We have the kind of mothers who do not know Heimlich, but who will shake us upside down to get beads or pennies out, and when they laugh, they spin us around and around till we're almost sick. Our mothers know about ginseng and Carnaby Street. We have mothers who make their own poisonous pigments and who keep vats of mulch on the patio. Mothers we need to tuck in at night after parties. Mothers we tell to please get more milk, and who is sleeping in my bed.
So you can kind of see, of course, the position of the viewer, the reader, is totally different in these. And again, the found object isn't sort of unlike the book world. They're exactly the kind of things you get in the museum shop for your kids, like the pop-up books, the pop-up theater. I think this one was actually mobilized from my bookshelf and just added. And trying to imagine, what does it mean to have stories that are in different orders? What does it mean to have reading experiences where, the voices can all come at once? So I think all of these are things that we have in the back of our mind as we imagine what kind of stories will be supported by what kind of technologies in the future. Again, these are early experiments on very cheap and affordable technologies. These were web-based works, and just had somebody at home printing out for nothing a marker and going to a website, and if they have a webcam, being able to access the work. So some of the work we did in this arena was for museums. We did quite a bit of work with the Toronto School Board, doing histories of the Underground Railroad, where some of the constraints were that the schools had no equipment and no money, and nothing could be lost. So paper-based work was really good, and we did poetry. So here's sort of, again, these early experiments in marker-based augmented reality. And this is a very straightforward narrative poem. I'm not going to run it for very long, but it really is, the viewer just goes screen to screen.
Arrived in borrowed coaches, wearing ill-fitting wigs, court breeches, hand-me-downs from family albums. All are known to us. Now, black as bells, the doors of the abbey are closing.
One of the things that also happens too as you start to work in this is that voiceover actually works better than text for many of these experiences. So you end up something that's more like a performance poem.
Her Majesty the Queen floats in procession.
I'll just go through so you can kind of see the experience of different visuals. And again, very simple. I think this was based off of Flower Toolkit. We had poetry. And again, so from one marker that will cost somebody nothing, you can have a whole...
That spoil the appetite, fresh virgin olive oil, vast strawberries cloud-borne from Mexico, marchpane, dark chocolate, walnuts, herring roe, exiguous cheese, puff pastry, thickly spread with chicken.
I guess we can always ask ourselves, why do we make, would this be any better than the print poem? Is this any better than a book? And we try to keep asking ourselves that whenever we work with new technology.
Meanwhile, from cafes ranged along the strip, like slots at Vegas, weeping maidens trip. Their makeup perishes.
Yeah, and go on. So we no longer actually work with those marker tracking systems. It seems like an ancient technology now, but it's actually very, very interesting for storytelling because it's so fast to work with the markers. And you know, we have groups of school kids who can work with the markers. Everybody can get up and running in augmented reality in about a 2-hour workshop. There are things that can really help to organize more complicated stories. So if you're interested in building a story that's maybe multi-branching, you can have collision detection. So you could have, the girl and the farmhouse, and when they're brought together, you have the fire. You've got ways where you could map out a very large interactive project. You could have different time of day in drag and drop 2D as well as 3D. So we still use it to bring charts to life. We can do sort of like Harry Potter newspapers for people, living postcards, doll houses. My own children have made lots of augmented reality toys and puzzles, sorting hats. And it's also a theoretical device to understand how a story's working. So these are some of the pop-up worlds that I showed you. Some of our collaborators. I'll just show you. This is one of the, this is part of the curriculum for the Toronto District School Board now.
He was appointed Constable of the County of Essex on April 12, 1881. There is no record of slavery in Anthony's family at all. He was born a free man on June 29, 1840 in the town of Colchester, Ontario. Anthony worked
So they're
into my own hands and dashed for freedom with 7 of my 9 children. Even William Still, the abolitionist, found the journey I embarked on remarkable.
So there are lots of stories here, and I'm not thinking that anybody actually is going to look at 30 vignettes of the Underground Railroad up on a computer screen. Part of it is trying to imagine 5 years from now, how will this be used? I mean, already from the time that we created this, now we've put it into a game engine. It's an app. You can download it from the App Store. It doesn't work with black and white markers. It works with historic photographs. And so essentially, that's a book. You could actually order it bound, or we could actually sell it bound, and then you just download the app for free. And you have a history.
So it's easy. What you can
I think we also have to remember that generationally, the things we might not put up with, kids now are working on iPads and with these new technologies from the time they're little, and not just as being on the receiving end of culture.
And up and down.
Yeah, they're also creating it. So, I have 2 kids who are now 8 and 11, and they've been coding and working in augmented reality and building things, and they will be very different. They'll have very different literacies than I have. We also have work that then starts to dovetail very much with installation, but I still think is very, very close to digital literature and storytelling. So back in the fall, my colleague Janine Marchessault curated a very large exhibition at Landslide, and one of the areas that I worked with my students to animate was the old, it's essentially like a pioneer village up in Markham. So there was the old country store, and we created, so the slide on the right, you can sort of see, so there's a store, and then by holding up the iPads, you could, the fires, the stories, and then we looked at all the, number of primary documents from the site and took people's diary experiences and then had fiction overlays. So essentially, you're building a story that that's in an immersive installation context, but it's the same kind of skills as book building. I guess what I'm also trying to get at here is that in much of the same way that we talked a little bit about this morning, that my understanding of the book and of ebooks and of electronic literature has necessarily, I think at many times I felt forced into areas, the moving image, the voiceover, it's relentless. It's very hard to just stay on the page in an area where I am. On the other hand, I think that there's enormous potential in the way that the book is changing, and that what we bring to the books, and that for those of us who love words and love literature, that this is also so intimately related to this installation work now, to museum practices, to the creation of apps, that it can be so instrumental in the creation of games that are compelling and meaningful. So, I don't want you to think that this is like so far off the book. I think this is actually really the near future for a lot of things as all of our practices begin to collide. So this was kind of the viewing situation in Markham, where people had on their headsets and actually just experienced an augmented story around them. You might think of it as maybe like an immersive text or an immersive book through an iPad. And again, this is where, when you think about HCI and user experience, there's not a person in the world who likes to come in and put on a headphone. And we also had to have security devices because there were like hundreds of people who came through. So nobody wants to be tethered and have earphones and they can't move. But if you suspend disbelief for just a second and say, what do we learn about the stories of the future and what people will put up with? People didn't put up with really bad e-readers either. I remember in 2001 people being like, oh, nobody will ever read those. Well, everything's so much better and you don't have eye strain and you're not sick on it. And people will read on real estate this big, and people said it wouldn't happen. People will actually engage with this work. And right now it's incredibly clunky, but already those changes are beginning. We have things that look more like toys than stories. One of the things that I did for my daughters was to turn, once we moved from the technology from those black and white marker sets and could begin to have natural feature detection, which means detecting features on everyday objects and being able to have the computer recognize those, I started to just get stones and things from the garden and add fairies to them and add stories. So you can go around almost, like a hunt and yeah. So, I think we're closer to a cinematic practice than a narrative one, but it's still interesting to imagine that you have objects that are haunted and that are filled with different kinds of stories. And, all of the things you're doing here, you could be a stone, but it could also be a book. It could be old books. They could be comments on things you love. Any analog object can be enhanced. And the question would just be, why would you want to do it? And what would be compelling about the end result? And, what kind of desire would that create in the user, and why would you do that? I have a large ongoing project that's worked across a lot of different technologies, so a large spatial novel in progress called Cardamom of the Dead. One of the things that I think is changing is that in these practices you used to have these really short stories, especially once you moved to handheld devices, there was a sense that the granularity had to be really, really, people's attention spans would be really short and you didn't have much screen real estate, so you ended up with a lot of very, very short pieces. And I think now we're finally at the time where we can start to move back into really sustained fictional worlds, certainly. One of the things I was thinking about after hearing this morning's speakers talking about HCI and what things can do and how books can be how books can be turned into apps, and what kind of features you'd like. I had an early version of a piece called Castle, funded by the Canada Council. And in the early version, it was actually, I thought, very, 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 very clever, and it was also very easy to figure out how people would access it. So there would be an app, and they would download one piece of paper. It was one marker. It was a sundial. and that would generate a 3D model, and it would be filled with these stories. And of course, as soon as we started to user test it, we realized like nobody had any idea of how this would work. Nobody even knew to use the touch screen on the iPad, so you had this, fairly large bit of real estate. We thought it worked quite well. I mean, there were probably about 40 embedded stories, and you could turn it, and it went from night till day, and every little window you touched would have different stories, and gradually, like it accumulated, and you got a sense of what was happening in this castle, and nobody did it at all. So it was, total disaster, although it was the most elegant app. So this piece was actually showcased at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, where, this past fall, where they were showing a lot of electronic literature. And I made a very deliberate attempt. I mean, this is also what I heard going on today about trying to figure out the sweet spot between meeting people's existing literacies and what they need and what they want and making it easy for them, while at the same time trying to, push the envelope and create new kinds of literacies, and things are changing all the time. So, so this was really my waving the white flag and turning this piece into, oh, here's another embarrassing thing. So I turned it actually into a book. But what was interesting is that I thought it was totally bulletproof then. Like I had the app, it was a book. Here's an early prototype of it. It was just like, as if you found, an album in an old castle, and this is what Augmented largely. But one of the first things one of the users managed to do was unlock, somehow guess my lock password. You make them so that even kids can't access these. And there were like 40 selfies, becoming more and more frustrated as she just repeatedly took pictures of herself. It was actually incredibly funny. And if I didn't think there was like a huge ethical breach, I would actually have it as like a small video, because of course I had to run back to the location and get the exhibit up and running again. But it was such a beautiful portrait of user frustration. And because at first she's really happy, like the buttons are working, and then she's like, almost like wanting to spit on it. And one of the things I would say too is that I don't think, for those of us who aren't immediately thinking that 1,000 people have to get this and it has to go to market immediately, there's a luxury of producing work that is difficult to access. And there's also nothing wrong with producing work that people don't know how to use right away, because you can help people to use it. And a lot of exhibitions of sort of more experimental digital literature, you will have docents. One of my colleagues, Jenny Grigar, out on the West Coast, actually teaches a course in how you would, basically it's like being a museum curator for weird electronic literature. And at the Modern Languages Association conference, for the last 2 or 3 years, they've had exhibitions of digital literature, both sort of historic, sort of coming from the 1980s, different platforms, having older computer generation versions so that pioneering works could be shown. But one of the things they always have is somebody right beside the piece to say, this is how it works. And that doesn't work, of course, in a commercial context, but it certainly works in a gallery context. So this is largely the setup. And I'll show you a little bit about this piece. So one of the things that's different about this piece, and where it becomes more bookish, and where I'd suggest that the convergence becomes more powerful, is that that it essentially consists of an analog book and a digital overlay that can just be provided in the form of an app. And in my case, most of the time, I don't actually have objects look like book objects, but it's a very easy combination, and very easy to code at this point. So I'm not going to sort of run through the whole piece. I'll just show you a little bit though about how it works. So each page has different things that pop up. It's largely spoken word. There is text. Most of the text is provided in the form of archival newspaper objects, so there's sort of a mystery that takes place through the piece. There are different kinds of architecture, so it's sort of basic 2D, 3D overlays, video, voiceover, and this piece will, so we just, yeah. I could actually show, let me just see if this, if this is still on, and then you can see it live, because it renders in real time. Whoops, hang on here. Get it further away. So you just have your ordinary book, and then, of course, you can't see the sound. And, yeah, and then the question is just sort of like what the story,
Have you tried written text as part of the animation?
Yeah, we actually have on many occasions. Even that 2008 poem with the pop-ups had a lot of moving image text. There's some beautiful poetic works that actually use like just text. So this piece doesn't, and it hasn't generally been my practice. But yeah, you can absolutely, and of course you can go in and you can investigate these spaces. The sound isn't on these. But it can also be powerful. It can also, you can imagine that these are add-ons to other work that you're doing. These could be postcards that advertise your book, right? I mean, these are, I'm seeing increasingly, at bookstores that, this is one I like too. And you can, I like the burning morning after bed. So, but these can be, you can track any kind of thing. You could actually just have your book cover tracked. You could have just one aspect of that. I mean, this is why it's sort of, also powerful in advertising, but I also think that it's great for stories. That's my time, actually. For my time. All right. Thinking again today when people were talking about future-proofing, certainly in the area I work, we can never future-proof, but I mean, it's devastating to think of colleagues who, who scanned things in 10 years ago at 72 DPI because it was never going to get better than that. People who, had, thousands, 10,000 hours, making models that were just these impoverished resolutions. Right now, most of the work I do, we have to get things, we have students shooting on red cameras, and I'm like, no, debase the image, no, more impoverished, like this size. We actually use very, very small files, but we don't kid ourselves. We try to do everything in the best quality, and then we archive that because everything is changing so quickly. So that would be just one of the things. And sometimes you just get lucky. We have sort of a decade's worth of work that was really bottlenecked, that was very, very tricky to access. Certainly a lot of our immersive work, it was site-specific. You would have to come up to the lab. A lot of the early marker-based work where, I was kind of joking, like, oh, you have to send someone instructions and code and whatever, but it's no joke, like you do. I mean, who's going to accept that for me? Like, there are a couple of like really dear friends and, a couple of cool people who would like a box filled with code and weird things and objects, and they make a story. There'll always be those people. Thank goodness. But one of the things that has happened really in the last couple of years, and in terms of our own workflow, is sometimes you luck out and there's something that helps all of your workflow and can help to translate a lot of your earlier works. So for us, we found that working in the Unity game engine with a plugin meant that we could put the immersive stuff in the trackers up. The same, very similar workflow would be to get something into the App Store. We can do handheld models. We can also make games. So well worth our time to learn how to do that. And what it's meant is that a lot of the early pieces can now be just distributed as apps that really had an audience of like 100, and now they'll be able to be circulating. This is something that's also very much closer to, I think, your own practices. Lest you think that none of this kind of resonates. This is one of my students, Helen Papagiannis, and part of her doctoral work is thinking about the future of the book. And she made some of the really early AR pop-ups and AR books. So I'm going to show you a little bit of her work, and I think this was made with a commercial software. But again, what I like about this book is that it does answer the question, why would you go digital rather than just have a regular book? And in her case, she's thinking, well, it sort of hinges on a bit of phobia research. I mean, you could delve more deeply, but I really like it because it makes a strong case for why this is a different experience. And again, it's pretty early. And sometimes from our lab, we do get things professionally produced. It's just me who glue sticks. nice about this is that as you slip your hand underneath, you don't lose the tracking. In a lot of the early iterations of the software, it was very easy to lose the image entirely. But this way, you kind of get to have the spider play on your hand. And there are other features that you can imagine would be quite, using some of the basic touchscreen capability. There's also the basic capability of sending the reader to a web page to get more information. So now she's clicked on the ant, and you can go to all your information about ants. I have another student who's ABD who's doing his all of his dissertation as an app as well. It's an ebook. One of the things that I'd, just in terms of talking about translation again, how do you get, so this is an example, that early pop-up theater that I showed you that was kind of the one-off that was sort of more gallery. Now it can easily be an app. So it's been turned into, with Unity, instead of it being the black and white markers and the figures, it's actually like a treasure chest of objects. It's more like a museum thing. So each one of these objects would have associated stories, and you can see people going through. And so for us, this also means that there are new distribution possibilities. So this will just be at the App Store, and people can download their own sort of treasure chest and have their paper markers and have the same experience that a gallery visitor would have had. We also do a lot of mobile cinema. We have some custom code of GPS cinema that makes it very, very easy to tell spatial stories. And one of the things that the reason I kept this slide in is just simply that I think it will dovetail with other kinds of practices. Being able to work really, really quickly in a basic software means that we'll have a lot of understanding about telling more complicated stories, including literary ones in space, when I think the books will also go spatial. We have students who've worked with a lot of, I think this is just Layer, there's Junaio, there's Erasma. This is one of my students. This is a student who's doing the ebook dissertation, but he also has a group called Manifest AR, and they were they had quite a good little intervention at the MoMA, where they came in uninvited and put augmented reality around. So these could also be great tie-ins, I always think, for books, as you imagine people creating their own content. Now that you have natural feature detection, almost anything in your world can become an occasion for you to be able to use that as real estate for your stories or for your product. We're also hosting, this time, Governor General Award-winning artist Wallis Edwards. So he has about a dozen children's books out. He's very well known as standard print book, and he's well known for basically being an illustrator, but he's funded through the Canada Council to come to the lab and to kind of imagine his practice beyond the print book. And we've been creating augmented reality pop-ups. He's working in the Oculus Rift, so he's created an entire virtual reality environment that kind of has his visual sensibility. We've taken all sorts of 3D models and have skinned them with, he's got this quite elaborate visual sense, and so, we've got all these tattooed monsters. And he's also working on a hybrid book with us. I hope it stays with us, but it would be, one of his other books that he's quite well known for is called Mixed Beasts, and it's a combination of, two or more animals into a sort of a mythical third animal. So I wanted to bring it here today, but we're working on a book where there's sort of, picture A and picture B, and the augmentation would be the mixing. So there'll be so you could actually have a book that exists quite beautifully as a standard book that's sold, and people could be not even interested in the digital component and would still have a pretty good reading experience. But the value added by having the augmentation would be this entire other layer. So that's actually just a little bit of,
And so
we also
these
made
little
toys.
tubes, you print them out and wrap them around a toilet paper tube, and then you make this little factory where they go kind of spinning through, and you make your own little path. As you move these around, they kind of, and this
Yeah.
is sort of an early iteration. This was like the first draft. So,
Yeah,
kind
so we had him making little robot factories
lovely.
and toys, and to sort of think of yourself beyond, you know, as an illustrator coming here.
So
So
sort
we
of
can-
as you, yeah. There's another one with smoke, and there'll be another one with
Yeah.
toy.
So making toys, and here's the Oculus Rift. So this is, at the moment, it's about a 15-minute experience, but again, it's, you know, it's storytelling, and you're kind of on this big whale as you go through the world that he's creating. And I think part of it is really, really interesting to work with somebody who really comes from watercolor illustration, because the questions are actually very, very different, and we've had to spend a lot of time thinking about what projects add value at all, and how you can, and his ideas that, you know, that he has for the future of children's books have been really, really fascinating. We're also doing a very traditional ebook with Richard Ehrlich, who's an amazing foreign correspondent in Southeast Asia, and he's got a very out there book called Sheila Carpenter's, and I'll tell you this, and you'll have half the story, but you know, about like 80,000 illustrations. So, you know, has been working on, and, you know, so we can turn these into environments and moving images with it. And so this will be a very traditional ebook, but he's a very, very interesting guy, and it's going to be a very, very cool book. I'm just going to close also by, I know it's late, and now I know I'm taking up too much time. We have a number of pending grants. One of the ways that I think this is going is that work in augmented reality with coming of not just Glass, but this is Steve Mann's Meta, and we're showing Google Glass there. But if, in fact, we have some cool early experiments where people can walk through a world and actually experience a meaningful story, we understand that people could spend 30 hours in a computer game. It does not seem reasonable that all of this digital mobile work has to consist of, you know, like 10 pages maximum. So I'm thinking of long-form interactive novels that could be different parts of the text that are served up at different parts of the day or based on when people went through them. So we've got a grant in around new literary and cinematic forms with Steve Mann, and another long-form interactive narrative of 30 hours of a literary dreamscape that's also under consideration. And so I guess just to conclude here, I'm thinking, you know, if I were trying to pretend to be prescient, but I'm really not. I think a lot of this is just near future stuff and is happening already. Of course, there are going to be, you know, as you know, I mean, there will always be, you know, print books will be around. We're going to have more digital books, but I think there will be convergence of different kinds of practices. There will be augmented books. There will be books that converge more with game and cinema and installation. There are going to be better mobile works. And I think people will still want to touch and feel, and that there will be this possibility where augmented reality could actually work incredibly well for publishing. Yeah, and I guess, forgive the typo there, but I also think that there are a sweet spot between existing literacies and pushing the boundaries. I think actually, if I were to say sort of a final thing, is that I think that's actually where we are in this room. I think that it's really, really important to, yeah, I was typing this like on the way here. I'll just go to the next slide. But I think it's really, really important to have kind of experimental out there practices that don't have audiences yet, where some of them, you have as many misses as you have hits. And I think, I would argue, I hope that that also feeds what you do with, you know, meeting the needs of your audiences now, and being receptive to what people want and need, and that those kinds of things, and also your brilliant design work as opposed to our crappy design work. But I think all of these things are really important in the ecosystem as we imagine stories of the future. So there we go. Thank you very much.